Phones, voices. We're going to take a look at the active and passive voices. They have been touched on in other slideshows here, but as we build to bigger charts, more complicated grammar, I thought it would be a good idea to review some things. Some pieces of other slideshows are here, so if some of this looks familiar, there's a reason for it. You've seen it before. So let's take a look at the two main voices that we have in Greek. So let's take a look at our energetiki phony. Energetiki phony. Phony, of course, is voice, like phone, xylophone, phonogram, telephone, and things like that. Energetiki may look and sound familiar. So where we get the word energetic from. Okay. So the active voice is used to describe what the subject does, what it acts upon. We use the active voice in English about 80% of the time. There's specific reasons we should and should not use it. And in Greek, it is equally common, as it is in every language. The important thing to remember here is that when we're in the present tense and we're talking about the first person singular, that means I write, I see, I do, the ending will always be omega. There's no other possible ending. When we talk about something I do in the active voice, in the present tense, the ending will be omega. Now let's look at our pathitiki phony. This is the second major voice. There are more, but they're not important at this time. The pathitiki phony, this may sound familiar. If you look at pathitiki, yes, we get the word pathetic from it, but pathetic is not quite the negative word that we might think it is in English. We associate it with suffering or something that happens to someone, what they suffer, what they go through, what is done to them. So the passive voice, the pathitiki phony, is used to describe what the subject suffers or undergoes, what happens to the subject. In Greek, passive voice verbs in the present tense or in the first person, meaning I'm doing them, always end in me alpha iota. And again, there's no exception to this rule. By the way, a good little extra lesson here is to look at the word pathitiki, pathos, passion or suffering, and you can see all these words that we get. Pathetic, patient is a person who suffers. Passion, when you love something so much it hurts. Pathos, pathologist, a person who studies suffering, a doctor. Pathogen, a thing that gives birth or causes suffering. Apathy, the lack of feeling. Empathy, sympathy, all of these words and many more come from this word. So the passive voice, even the word passive, comes from the Greek pathitiki. So, like we said, all of these words are going to end with me alpha iota, me. If you're a student of ancient Greek who doesn't really understand the history of Greek pronunciation, you may want to call this me alpha iota. In these slideshows, we'll call it me. Okay, so let's take a quick look at the present tense active and passive voices. Now, this is for regular type 1 verbs, verbs that just are the run-of-the-mill standard verbs. There's nothing unique about them. Okay, let's take a look at some examples. These are from a previous slideshow. And we'll start with the verb grafo, which means I write. And you can see I've got the stem, the red part up there, the part that isn't going to change for the most part. So grafo is I write. And when we want to build a normal present tense active verb, we're going to just take our stem right here, graf, and I've got it here 6 times because we'll need it for the 6 persons. I, you, he, she, it. And then the plurals, we, you, all, they. And we bring our endings in, the very familiar endings that we've had for a long time, ever since we've started with verbs. And we have grafo, grafis, grafi, grafume, grafete, grafun. I write or I am writing, you write or you are writing, and so on. Well, to make the passive voice, we're really going to follow the same pattern. We're going to start with graf again, and you'll notice there are 2 red alphas down there. I'll get to those in a moment. But our stem is still the same. It's still graf. But now we're going to take these new endings and snap them on there. And we wind up with grafome, grafese, grafete, grafomaste, grafosaste, grafonde. And these are, as the name of the grammar tells us, these are passive. I am being written. You are being written. The most common one, grafete, is written or is being written. So if you wanted to ask, hey, how is this written? You would say, pos grafete. Okay, now let's take a closer look at this part here. You can see that the alpha in the active voice is the same in graf, and all of them have the accent, the tono or the oxia, as it should be called, on the alpha, and it's there for all 6 persons. What happens down in the passive voice, however, is we get it in the beginning and we get it in the end. However, for we are written, grafomaste, and you guys are being written, grafosaste, the accent shifts to the right. And if you can't see it, the reason for that is that these have an extra syllable, and the Greek rules of accenture require us to have an accent on one of the last 3 syllables, no exceptions. And we'll talk more about that later, and we'll certainly cover it in class. Now let's take a closer look at this passive voice. You can see at the top we've got graf, and on the right side we've got ome, grafome. I am written. Well, if we look at the table at the bottom, and now it's here in blue, let's take a look at these endings because actually we have seen these before. We'll separate them from there. Ome, esse, ete, omaste, osaste, onde. It may or may not look familiar to you at first, but when we bring in the verb to be, we can see that these are almost exactly the same, actually, and the letters in red on the right side are the ones that aren't changed between the two. As far as the left side, there are changes made whenever you make compound words, which these originally were. Also, omicron and epsilon have a unique relationship, as do O's and E's in English. They're often swapped for each other. They're both very weak vowels. For those of you who've studied ancient Greek, you'll also know that omicron and epsilon never take a circumflex, perispomeni. So when we say the word grafome, what we're really saying is write, and it's not a verb or a noun, it's just a concept almost. Graf by itself is nothing. Plus I am. Grafome, I am written. I am in a state of being written. And that's how so many of these verbs are formed. Almost any verb that you have in the active voice can be brought into the passive voice or something that looks like the passive voice. Now, there are some traps. These cause people a lot of problems, especially people who never really learned how to read or write Greek. And if we take a look here at the blue ones, the blue lines, at the top we have grafete, which means you all write, like you guys write or you guys are writing. At the bottom, we also have grafete, except this time we have an alpha iota, which means he, she, or it is written. Now, to the ear, there's no difference in modern Greek. A lot of people, especially in Western countries, would say that the bottom one is pronounced grafetai. There's some argument there that's still going on. There's some disagreement about the pronunciation of the alpha iota. But in modern Greek, these are both pronounced grafete. The only way to know, aside from context, which one you're using, is by being able to read it. And the alpha iota should give away that you're dealing with the passive voice. So we have to be careful here. We also have to be careful with these green ones. We've got grafume, that's an ume, which is sometimes said as grafome. Sometimes that epsilon is not there. And at the bottom we've got grafome. Well, grafume at the top is we write. At the bottom, grafome is I am written. Um, Probably a less common verb, although it could sometimes be used for I am enrolled or I am signed up. So let's take a look just to give you an idea of some of the most common verbs that you'll see in this form. Okay, so now let's take a look again at contract verbs. These were also mentioned in another slideshow. I've repackaged the explanation here. There are three main types of contract verbs. They have names. We call them the alpha contracts, the epsilon contracts, and the omicron contracts. The most common ones are the alpha. So we'll get a word like agapao, which means I love, boreo, which even a pretty good speaker of Greek may never have heard before, and the law. The law is I declare. Boreo, to go back to that, is, well, we'll leave it until you see it in contracted form. Now, the idea was that verbs were originally written and said this way, but it's kind of inconvenient to say agapao, boreo, vilo. And that third one is really tricky because we've got to say the omicron and the omega, which are both o sounds. Now, some verbs still keep this old form, but many of them have been contracted. That is, the last two vowels have been squished into one. So agapao has become agapo, boreo has become boro, which many of you will recognize as I am able, or I can, or I may. And the law is the law. No real difference in pronunciation there. The squiggly mark that you see above the omega, which I know some people are unhappy to see because it's not really used very much in Greek these days. Some people still use it. This is called a perispomenon. In Greek, it's called a perispomeni, and it's also called a circumflex. And it basically represents a vowel that has been eaten up. So if you look at boreo, well, that epsilon was removed and it was just replaced by the circumflex on top of the omega. So all that perispomeni does is it represents a vowel that's been gobbled up. Okay, so here are three contract verbs. They still end in omega. Okay, so let's go back and take a regular verb like grafo from a few slides ago. We'll put wafel here on the board. Wafel is I paint. It used to mean I dip, and it's related to words like baptizo, I baptize, because when you dip the baby in the water, it's kind of like dipping the brush in the paint. So vafo, vafis, vafi, vafume, vafete, vafun. Okay, these are standard endings, and these are the most common. There are thousands of verbs that end with these, and these are active. And we could go on and on about the list of verbs that use these, but what we want to do is see how they compare. Here's a list of some of these regular active verbs: cano, cello, frondizo, zilevo, anigo, echo, antejo, diavazo, pleno, stazo. All of them are in the same category of regular verbs. But how do they stack up against the contract verbs? What's the difference and how can we identify them? Well, here's a list of contract verbs here. We have agapao, milao, cratao, colimbao, stamatao, perpatao, traudao, voithao, telefonao, tolmao, boreo. And of course, you can tell that last one was an epsilon contract. I didn't even bother putting an omicron contract in. It's just not necessary at this stage. So you can see the two vowels at the end. Okay, ao, eo, and like we said before, o. Well, what a contract verb is going to do is it's going to take those last two vowels and they're going to contract into one. So now from agapao we get agapo, I love. From milao we get milo, I speak. Kratao, krato, kolibao, kolibo, and so on. So now we have this contracted ending. And like I said, you will hear both of these in most cases, though a lot of dictionaries, like the New Oxford Dictionary, will not list the uncontracted forms. Even though they're commonly used, they'll only list the contract forms on the right in dark blue. There's no other difference. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Poets and songwriters like having both of these available because sometimes when you need an extra syllable, you might use the one on the left. If you need to limit the number of syllables, which is very important in Greek poetry, you'd use the one on the right. So here's what we have thus far. We have our present tense active voice, okay, which we said has the standard endings. Here I've got the verb pleno, which is I wash. Pleno, plenis, pleni. Plenume, plenete, plenun. I wash, you wash, he, she, or it washes, we wash, you all wash, they wash. We also have the present tense passive voice. We still have plen as our base, as our stem. Plenome, plenese, plenete, plenomaste, plenosaste, plenonte. Plenome is I am washed. It could also be I wash myself. This is the old middle voice of Greek. There's a couple of other uses as well. Then we have the present active for contract verbs like kratao or krato, I hold. Kratas, krata or kratai, kratame, kratate, kratane. And there are different forms of these, but this is just one of the most common sets. There are some variations. Well, now what are we going to do to express kratao, I hold, in the passive voice to say I am held? Or kratai in the passive voice, it is held. Well, to do that, we're going to need a new set of endings that are really not all that difficult. If we look at the right side, we'll see our old friend ime. I am. Ime, ise, ine. Imaste, isaste, ine. Okay, I am, you are, he, she, it is, and so on. Well, some version of these is going to be used in the passive voice. Kratieme is how we're going to say I am held. Kratiese, kratiete, kratiomaste, kratiosaste, kratiunde. And these are really not that different from ime. If you compare the red letters here at the top left and ime on the right, you'll see plenty of similarities. There are three flavors, kind of like there are three types of contracts. Remember the alpha, epsilon, and omicron contracts? Well, there are three flavors of the passive voice for contracts. Lipume is I am sad. Now, this is not necessarily a passive voice. It just means I am sad. It has an active meaning, but it looks like a passive voice verb. That's why we call it that. We put it in this category. Verbs that are active in meaning but look passive are called deponents. We'll talk about those another time. Look at the endings though. Lipume or lipame, I'm sorry or I am sad. Lipase, lipate, lipumaste, lipaste, lipunde. Again, very, very similar to ime, ise, ine, and so on. Then if we look at the bottom, kinume, kinume, I move, or I am moved. Kinume, kinise, that's exactly like ise on the right side. Kinite, kinumaste, kiniste, also like iste on the right side. And kinunde. Now, which ending to use with which verb takes a little bit of practice. But after a while, you'll be able to identify the patterns. And believe me, there's a lot of overlap, and many of the forms are even the same. You could even say the wrong thing and still be understood. So no worries so far. We're going to try and just identify these. We don't have to memorize them. We just have to identify them. Well, this has been another confusing episode of more Greek grammar. But hopefully it's helped clarify a couple of things. If you have a book, if you're in a Greek school class, if you're studying Greek on your own, whatever you're doing, feel free to refer back to this. I'll post more all the time. And good luck with your passive voice and your active voice. And I'll see you next time. Telos.